Welcome to the Small Steps, Big Wins podcast. I'm dedicated to helping you take control of your life. Are you ready? Let's go do this. So, Lori, welcome to the Small Steps, Big Wins podcast. I'm so glad
Thank
you're
you. I'm
here.
excited to be here, Sue. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I love to let my guests, let's just jump right in. I love to let my guests tell their story, and you can start where you'd like, and we will go from there, wherever you'd like to go.
Well, I think that I will give a brief overview. I am the host and the producer of the Love Your Story podcast. And so we're really focused on stories. And that branches from a place of I originally was not very, let's say I was definitely not at peace with my story. So my story, I had been married 3 times and divorced 3 times. And I how did my life turn out that way? Like, it just felt like so much failure and so much disappointment and so much heartbreak. And I come from a space, a culture, a religion where, family is very important and divorce is not a thing that you want to engage in. And so there was a bunch of shame and discomfort around that whole, just, the whole 20 years of that happenings. And so as I looked at that and tried to figure out how to come to peace with it and how to sort through it, because I had a burden of cynicism about men, stories of how crappy they all were and there were no good ones and all of that was very heavy. And then I ended up doing some emotional intelligence training that was really crucial for me in learning how to reframe. So we can talk about reframing today too, because that's small steps for really, really big wins. But that
Yeah, sure.
reframing, how to reframe all the things that had happened and look at them from a sense of meaning and learning and growth that I had had rather than just the heartbreak. And so I worked on that, went through that process, and then studied personal narrative in my master's degree work. And so all of that came together to lead me to a place of creating the Love Your Story podcast, where we talk about stories. People share their stories, their path of getting through really hard things or accomplishing really great things, how they did that, and then talking about, and we've been doing this for 8 years. Sometimes we have therapists on, sometimes we have coaches, sometimes we have Olympians, sometimes we have normal everyday people, but we're talking about stories, and that's what makes us all human. And we share how we got through or how we created something big, and then talk about the things that we've learned from all of that. Learned so much and been privy to so many things. But the reason that I would tie this, or the way that I would tie in that story with what you do here with the small steps, is that I really have come to understand that growth and forward movement through the hard things is one small step after another. For some people, when you've gone through the death of a child or the suicide of a spouse or an eating disorder, things that just really rip our hearts out, because you realize that sometimes it's just you survive from 1 minute to the next minute. It's one small step to just survive through the pain, through the heartbreak, through whatever it is. And personal growth is that way. Like, we could talk about so many angles here, but certainly my story, my healing, my coming to a place of turning it into something good, a little alchemy there with the stories, is one small step at a time.
Yeah. Well, let's go there first. What was the turning point for you where you decided to start that podcast? Because we all have that small step. There was something for you that was the catalyst.
So I
Do you
would say that
remember?
the catalyst was that I'm an author and a journalist by trade and have done that for many years. And I wanted to write a book, like all good authors do, right? That changed, that made the
Mm.
world a little bit better. And at that space where I had gotten to a place where I had reframed my stories and was feeling good about it, it was something that I wanted to share and help other people do and talk about and continue that process. But instead of writing the book, it just ended up, I can't even remember how it shifted to a podcast. It was because it was hard. It was a hard thing to create that podcast because I didn't
Mm.
know about the technology. I was just starting from scratch, learning what podcasts were, figuring out the technology, finding the people to help me. It was very much a one small step at a time to create, what I wanted to create. And sometimes I'd have no idea what I was doing and I would have to figure that out. And it was just a decision to maybe find somebody who could teach me that thing, or go to some conference and try to glean as much as I could from it. It's all those little steps that come together.
Yeah, I mean, I hear in your story like you just found people that helped and you took one step at a time. I mean, I started a podcast from scratch too. I had no idea. And people don't realize how much goes into it. There's a lot of behind the scenes work that
So
goes
much.
from what they're listening to here to actually getting it out and having it distributed to the masses and whoever listens. There's just so much in between. And you're right, there's things you have to learn along the way. And taking each of those small steps, and it teaches resilience too, I think, because and determination, because both of those things, and a desire to want to put your story out there. Like you have a big why, your why behind it was to share your story and then to get other people's stories out there
Well,
too.
I have come to peace with my story. So it's not even something I feel
Hmm.
particularly inclined to share. You'll notice when we talked about it, I
Right.
didn't go into a whole bunch of detail or blame or drama, because I just don't feel any of those things anymore. And I think that
Hmm.
that's part of what the growth is. I started the
Hmm.
podcast because I'd come to a place of peace about my story and understood, because of my graduate work and personal narrative, how important those stories are and how subjective they are, and how the function of story is humans share story, and our minds understand story better than any other
Hmm.
form of communication, right? Like we create and can remember things better in a story form than a bullet point list, right? So we have
True.
always shared stories to share awe, to share experiences, to create teaching, to learn, to, give perspective. Like there's all kinds of functions for the personal narrative. And understanding that and realizing how beautiful and diverse and that everybody has a story was part of the impetus for the podcast, not necessarily just my story.
Yeah. 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 Well, yeah, I agree with you on that because, after a while, I mean, just telling our stories,
I'm bored.
you can
I'm
only
bored with
you
my
can
own
only
story.
yeah, you can yeah, you can only get so many podcasts on your like who you are as a person. I mean, yeah, you could go on other people's podcasts, but if it's your own, yeah, I get it. But to get other people's stories out there, and the same thing with mine too. Everybody has those micro movements, and you just mentioned them before, micro movements that we take that do produce really big growth. You mentioned before that you wanted to talk about reframing and your story.
So, reframing is a situation where I think the first thing you need to understand is how subjective your individual story is. Like, we can all be looking at the same event and we're going to take different things away from it because of the lenses that we're looking through. And that's often known as the cultural eye. And the cultural eye, picture that you have like a telescope that you're looking through, and it is all of the things that make up the lenses in that telescope are, let's say, your gender, your religion, your socioeconomic status, your sexual proclivities, your, which side of the tracks you live on. I mean, all of the things that make us different, right? The experiences that you've had, all of these things are different lenses that stack in front of us. And then everything we look through, we see through those lenses. And I think this is a super interesting thing to comprehend, because when you comprehend it, you realize why every person on the planet sees things so differently, because we're all looking through our own set of cultural lenses, race, all of the things. Like all of them just stack, 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 stack. You're looking through from your perspective, and everybody has that different perspective. So when you start realizing this subjectivity of your story and what you've created in your mind, you also start realizing that we create our own realities. We're going to think our realities are our reality, the truth. I saw that. I know how this went down. This is exactly what happened. But when you break anything apart, you realize there are other cultural eyes. The other people that were involved in the story with you were seeing things in a different way. There's all kinds of parts and pieces of the story as far as how it's structured and how things played out the way they did. When you start giving the benefit of the doubt, when you start trying to look from somebody else's perspective, when you start opening up, then you start getting a little flexibility. Not that your perception is wrong, but there are ways to tell your story that are supportive of you, and then there are ways that are damaging to you that keep you in a victimhood space. So when you're reframing a story, your first step is to accept it. Now, I have a whole set, it's a 5-step process on the Love Your Story podcast, and I did one episode about each of these steps. And it starts, I think it's all the way back at episode 46. So go to loveyourstorypodcast.com, go to the episodes, go back to 46, 47, 48, 49, 50. And it's basically a free class on reframing your stories. You just listen to those and do the parts and pieces as I break it down. So free reframing. But the first step is acceptance. You there may be things in your story you're ashamed of. There may be things that have happened that you're in denial about. There may be things that you're like I was mentioning earlier, how is this my life? How did this happen to me? I'm smart, I'm on top of things, I'm successful, I'm all these things. How did my life end up looking like this? And,
Yeah, I think we all have those moments,
yeah,
don't we?
absolutely. We're
Really,
talking about a human
it's yeah,
phenomenon.
right,
Yeah.
right.
So that acceptance is coming to a space of, okay, that really happened to me. That really is a part of my life. This is a piece of what's going to make or break me. I get to truly just accept, maybe with a heavy sigh, that this is my story. And this is it.
Yeah. So for acceptance, is there things like meditation and practical things to do, like mindset or breathing around it, or story work around the breathing in order to bring yourself to that
I
acceptance?
think there are a lot of great
Do you?
tools, and I think everybody's going to need
Yeah.
something different because
Right.
of where they're at with it. Sometimes it's just an acceptance of accepting, like, okay, I need to accept this. And you sit with yourself and you accept it. And sometimes you need a
Hmm.
coach. Sometimes you'll need a therapist. You know what tools you have
Right.
and where you're at. And so sometimes it is something that you'll need. And the second step is to be able to tell your story. And these might seem simple, but stories, especially dark stories, have a retain a lot of power when they are kept buried. And when I say tell your story, that doesn't mean you have to get on social media or YouTube or a podcast and tell everybody all your dirt. Not at all. By telling your story, sometimes it's choosing a very specific person in a safe place. Sometimes it's telling a therapist. Sometimes it's working it out with the person that you have a bad juju with. Sometimes Oprah had this, she shared this in one of her books where she had gotten pregnant as a young girl, and it's something that she had kept hidden for a long time. And when it came out, she was older and much just very established, but she was mortified when someone found it and leaked it out to the press. And she was just horrified by the idea and cried and was very upset and just didn't really, didn't dare go into work in the morning. And then when she did come out and face her people, she was surprised at how supportive they were. That there wasn't the abuse and the critical aspect that she had expected. Instead, there were some people didn't pay much mind to it. Other people were very supportive of her and, and were sorry that, her private life had been splashed. And, she got a lot of very positive responses, but she talks about how important and shocked that she was of how supportive that was and how wonderful it was to get off her shoulders. Like it was that
Hmm.
skeleton buried in the closet that is finally out, and you realize it's not as horrific, that there are other people who maybe have been through what you've been through, that there are people who are going to understand and support rather than pass judgment. And so being able to tell that, being able to accept it, right? You're accepting it and
Hmm.
coming to a place where you can actually put into words and take it out of the box where it's a hidden nightmare to, everybody to a different degree, but where it's something that you're hiding and it retains a bunch of power to free yourself from it. by actually putting it
Mhm.
into the words in the right space. So there's all
Mhm.
these little steps, and we've mentioned therapist in both steps. You may need them. I found with mine, you get to a place, and we don't have to go into all of the steps and in detail, but one of the spaces or one of the most important steps in the process is finding meaning in
Mm.
and learning, finding the like purpose and value and having gone through hard things. And that's a beautiful, powerful step, but sometimes it's very hard to do. Like
Yeah, that was going to be my next question because we can get stuck. I can see acceptance, that that's okay, this has happened. It happened. You move on to the next step, tell your story, and that could be either written or oral. Do you find one better than the other as far as communicating your story, written versus
Well,
oral?
again, I think that's personal. If you
It's
write it
personal.
out
Yeah.
like you're putting it into a book and you're wanting to publish it, that's a whole different thing than you and a therapist having a
Writing
chat,
it out.
right? So
Yeah.
if you
Right. Right.
want
Right.
if you want to write it out and that's a therapeutic way that you work through something, then you can do that and share it with the right person. Really that's up to you.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're to the point where you feel like it is something you need to put in book form. Lots of people are doing that today with
Right.
the self-publishing and
Yeah.
there's actually someone coming on my podcast at the first part of next year where she is a publisher that helps people to tell their stories, which is will
Mm.
be really interesting to talk to her. But there's a lot of power in people's stories.
Yeah.
That's why they come on my podcast to share their story. It's very therapeutic and they find a lot of power in writing a book about it and then wanting to share it. So there's
So,
places for little shares and there's places for big shares.
right, right. It's finding the right place. So now it's finding meaning in your story, which I think would be difficult to do. How would we do that?
Everybody's at a different place, right? So for some people, that might be
Sure.
really easy. You can look at it and say, I choose to focus on the fact that I learned X, Y, or Z instead of I choose to focus on the fact that he done me wrong. You know what I mean? It's all where you
Mm,
focus. We talk about it the good wolf and the bad wolf, and the one that survives is the one that you feed as far as mindset goes. Like, are you going
mhm,
to give more attention to the things you learned and the things you gained through something difficult? I find on the podcast as people tell their story, some of the things that they gain the most is love and support from people around them when they go through a hard thing. Like they didn't realize how much support and love they have from friends and family and community members until they go through
mhm.
this really hard thing. And they never would have known that if they hadn't gone through the hard thing. And so, something that you can gain
Right.
when you struggle is a connection with the people around you, which is incredibly important to humans. So there's always that. When I was married to a man who was emotionally abusive, I gained an insight into what it's like to be married in an abusive situation. And the reason that's significant to me is because I am a very strong female presence and I could never understand why women would tolerate abuse. I could never understand previous
Mm,
to this. I didn't understand why
right.
women wouldn't fight back. And in my experience of being married to him, I loved him. And every time he'd say he was sorry, and every time he would come back and want to work
Yeah.
through things, you hoped that it would work, right? Like
Yeah.
suddenly there's a deeper understanding of what it looks like. So, what did I gain? I gained a perspective shift. You know, I
Yeah.
gained a lot of experiences of different types of things. Each of my marriages had different problems. There wasn't a pattern that was repeating itself. Different people with different
Yeah.
issues and so you gain a lot of understanding. You gain a lot of strength. One of the things I gained through mine was that I know I can get through hard things. Like I know I'm tough now.
Hmm.
I got through 20 years of heartbreak and difficulty
Yeah.
and surviving things that just brought me to my knees over and over and over. Just tears, heaviness,
Did,
hard struggle. But I do know
yeah.
that I'm a survivor and I can do that. So there's all kinds of things that we can pull from our experiences, whether it's trust in ourselves, whether it's trust in God, whether it's trust in community and friends. There's all kinds of things, lessons that we
Mm,
learn, and being able to focus on those things, the things that we get out of the difficulty rather than the difficult things that were done to us. And rather than staying in the place of bitterness, just completely changes the subjective reality that we talked about. So you're either going to get better because you're
Mm.
focusing on the positive, or you're going to get bitter because you're focusing on the cynicism and the pain, the victimhood.
Yeah, really, it all boils down to either you're going to let that situation let you get better, or you're going to get bitter out of it, you know. And asking yourself, it almost sounds like you're asking yourself, like, what can I learn from
Mhm.
this, and how can I help somebody else that is going through that same thing. I find that the difficult challenges that I've walked through in my life, you don't see it when you're in it. Like I didn't see it while I was walking through it because I'm also divorced and had other issues that went with that too. And you don't see it when you're in it. But then now that I'm on the other side of it, I see other people who are struggling in it, and then I find I can relate to them more. I find sometimes they come to me for help, you know.
Yeah.
So sometimes when you're in the midst of something, it's not helpful to ask, "Why am I here?" Oh no, oh no. Just figure out how to go through what's happening, and then on the other side is, you know, you like we said, we either get better or you get bitter, and when you get better then it allows you to help other people, and I think it grows empathy
Well,
too.
you brought up a
So
really good point there, and it comes back to the small step to big wins. When you're going through something, I think it's very difficult to be like, "Oh, I'm gonna be happy about this, and I'm gonna find all the good
mhm,
that's going on," because sometimes just getting through something, you're not ready for that mindset yet. You're just trying to
right.
survive. So don't feel like this shift in your story has to happen while it's happening. If it can, and you can glean the good stuff while you're going through it, knock it out of the park, sister. Like, that's awesome. But for the most part, in the hard spaces, there's emotion that's overwhelming. There's loss. There's grief. There's stuff that's going on. That's why it's hard. And so the small step is I can make it through today, and I can make it through the next day.
Yeah.
One day at a time, I can
Yeah.
make it through. And maybe today I can get up and take a shower and not stay under the covers. And maybe today I
Yeah.
can think
Yeah.
about somebody else and serve somebody instead of staying wound up in my problems. Or maybe I could,
Yeah.
maybe I go to a safe place where there's relationships that support me. Like, just day by day, the small steps.
Just
And
something.
then when you
Yeah.
get to
Yeah.
that
One thing you
place where you
can.
can function a little bit better, to that place where you don't want to be in the bitterness, where you want to let the hurt go, then you can start the reframe. Then you can start the subjective shaping of the events so that they support you and they support your learning and growth rather than holding you back.
I want to pull out things that you mentioned that I think I don't want to let go of. And the first is when you're in the midst of a difficult situation, we're not always thinking about, okay, what is this going to look like on the other side, and how we're going to serve people, or how I can help somebody else walk through what I'm walking through right now. But I think while we're talking about it, and maybe somebody listening is actually not in the midst of something difficult, they're hearing this and we're absorbing it, so that when they actually are walking through it, then that subconscious has already been
We
planted,
hope.
and that when you come, yeah, and you hope, and that at the on the other side of it you have that, oh wait a minute, yeah, I heard that somewhere that said, I'm walking through this, and yeah, maybe I can help somebody in the midst of my difficulty. I heard it preached one time. Honestly, they were talking about how you just fill yourself up with almost like a toolbox of
Mm.
ways to, cope with situations that come your way, so that when they do come your way, you at least have something ready to be able to help you in that trial, in that difficulty, whatever
I
it
would
is.
call that emotional resilience. Like, emotional resilience, those are skills, you know?
Sure.
Things like developing good relationships, things like healthy thinking patterns, these things that can support us, knowing who we are and what our purpose is. These things are
Yeah.
emotionally and mentally supportive in a time and space in our culture where there's a lot of mental and emotional attack, depression,
Yeah.
anxiety,
I
all of the
agree.
mental things that we deal with. So, yeah,
Yeah.
what you're
I
talking about
agree.
is that toolbox is for the wise people who are in that space of paying attention to these things and accumulation of emotionally
Mhm.
resilient tools.
Yeah, emotional resilience, emotional intelligence, those are words that are new. At least I feel like
They
they're
seem kind
new.
of trendy, huh?
Uh, they seem kind of trendy. Yeah. I mean, it's not something that I would have heard 5 or 6 years ago. And I've been in the educational space for 20 years. And it was definitely not something you would have heard or we would have brought into the classroom. And, you didn't really worry about any of, your emotional intelligence. You didn't ask the kids, how are you feeling
It's a
today?
whole different
It
ballgame,
wasn't
isn't
like,
it?
where you, it
Yeah.
is. It's a much, much different culture. And when I think from what I remember from our conversation, we're kind of around the same age. So like you go back those 20, 30 years and you're like, wow, that stuff just was not around, but we see it today in a good way. I mean, it is really, it's good that we're asking those questions. How do you feel? How do you see yourself? Who are you? To go dig deep into who you are as a person, and then how you react to situations that are
There's a
around
lot
you.
of self-actualization going on now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is like an emergence of this. And the second thing you were talking about is you want to arrive at a place of acceptance, that we're getting there. It's just okay to be where we are to
Mm.
get to that place. And so yeah.
I think sometimes that's a particularly hard one depending on how much shame is involved, how much you thought. And the difference there is this is where you thought your life should be, what you should be, what that should
Hmm.
look like, and then this is what it actually looks like. And if there's
Yeah.
a bunch of shame and disconnect and discontent with what that is, then there's going to be anxiety. There's going to be struggle. There's going to be, shame and guilt and, all the other things that get woven into that. So that this acceptance of this is what is right now is so powerful because you can't really move forward without an acceptance of that because caught over here and then this is what it should have been, that's a space of just discontent, struggling, like beating your head against the wall
Right.
because that's not where you're at. You can't do anything, you can't move or grow from that place because it's all the what if or should have beens. So
Right.
you have to get to this
Yeah. It's
place
all
of
circular.
acceptance of this is where I'm at, this is what I've experienced, now what do I do? What? Yes, and like this is the great question. Yes, and this is what happened. Yes, and now what?
I've heard that come up a couple of times. I think the first time I heard it, Alex Hormozy had said that, and he was talking about our past experiences. And it's like, okay, so you had a really bad childhood, and yeah, it's like, okay, or you got knocked down, or you were divorced, and like, what's
Yeah, what's
okay?
next?
Like, just get what's next. You just have to move forward. And I think that's one of the big things that's coming out now that we really didn't have. Like, I know I didn't have that kind of emotional resiliency taught to me. I didn't have that framework. My parents got divorced when I was
Mhm.
13, and so we go back 40 years and you don't have that.
Well, and I think the more people that tell their stories, the more you realize the human condition is so
Yes,
similar across the board. So then there's less
I
of
agree.
there can be less shame because okay, divorce,
You're not
yeah,
the
you're
only
not the
one.
only one that's dealt with
Yeah.
divorce. You're not even the only one that's dealt with bad divorce. Like you're
Yeah.
50% of the populace has dealt with this. You can go to places, hear people's stories, support groups, understand how to get through
Yeah.
this in as healthy a way as possible. It doesn't have to be a bitter battle. It can be something that you
Right.
choose to walk through with your head held high, to do the things that you can be proud of when you're on the other side of it. It can be so much choice in how we deal with things and the stories we create around them.
Yeah. In your story, out of your story, you have pivoted many times. Like you've gone from coach to you've had online groups and coaching. You're an author, you're a speaker, you're a journalist, you're a podcaster. You've got all of these experiences and you've pivoted. What have you learned from those experiences and going from one to the next as part of your story?
That's a good question. And not all of those have been pivots. I kind of do a lot of them at the same time. But maybe
Hmm.
I think the biggest pivot that I think it will be interesting to the listeners is when I first started Love Your Story, I was offering coaching to help people reframe their stories because, you had talked about this earlier, like how do we reframe? I was helping people to do that. And I knew that we needed coaches to do that because even me, I had a master's degree in personal narrative. Like I understood how important it was. But as I was working through my story, I couldn't reframe it. Like I knew what had been done to me. I knew how hard I had tried. I knew all the things. They were fact. I was a victim. And I just couldn't reframe it until I had coaches help me to do that. So I knew that it was a thing where people needed help. I'd still listen to those 5 episodes and see how far you can get. But if you do them and you go through all the things and you still need help, then a coach is a great source. So I started out
Right.
doing that. But in along my path with my story, I would get so anxious about coaching people because while I could help them do it, I was always afraid before a meeting that I wouldn't be able to help them do it. And so
Mm.
it wasn't fun for me to coach. It wasn't fun, like it wasn't my zone of genius because I would get so anxious about what if I let him down or what if I can't do what needs to be done for him. And through that process I realized that's not where I want to be. Like I am happy to help people and I'm happy to have the conversations with them and I'm happy to share the stories and to even do reframing on the air. But the individual coaching isn't something that I want to put a lot of time into promoting, perpetuating. But where I did find is that after 8 years of producing and hosting the Love Your Story podcast, that I loved the producing and the hosting. And so my greatest pivot, as you say, was pivoting away from that. And I now produce podcasts for other coaches or therapists or any business owner really who wants to have a podcast, even private podcasts. So let's say there's a doctor's office who has recordings and information that need to go out to their clients and they want to have their own private podcast where clients can listen to information that they need to give
Mhm.
them on a particular disease or a different particular process, whatever. So, any business who is established and wants to have a podcast, either public or private, I help produce those now. So, they're good at what they do. Let's just take it as a coach. We have a woman who is a coach. She wants to focus on coaching, but she wants a podcast to support her coaching her people, right? Something they can listen to, something she
Mhm.
can promote, something that shows her expertise. She comes to me and I produce it for her. We start all the way at the beginning from the graphics, the editing, the syndication of it, the setting all the little parts and pieces up. Like you said earlier, producing a podcast has a lot of small steps to get to the big thing.
It
Yeah,
does.
there's way more. Like I could sit here and read a list off of all of the things that are involved, but that pivot for me from coaching into actually producing podcasts for people and business owners has been a great pivot for me. And it's brought me from non zone of genius, uncomfortable, anxious about doing something to zone of genius, something that I love doing and that I'm good at doing, that I enjoy and am excited about. And I think the process of learning that has been really key. How to not spend time in the spaces, building your story around things that you should be doing or, you know, can do but don't want to do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah. So out of that, so it begs a very interesting question. Then, when you look at the coaching from the outside, it seems like a failure, air
Mhm.
quotes, failure. So I'd love to know what your perspective is on failure and mindset.
You know what? That's really a very pertinent question for everybody's life because failure has such a
Right.
stigma, right? And particularly for the perfectionists of the world, like, wait, I can't fail, I can't do anything unless I'm going to
Yeah.
be able to do it perfect. And well,
Yeah, the mantra failure is not
yeah,
an option.
yeah.
I mean, I've said that to myself, I'm a recovering perfectionist. I probably still am a perfectionist at some point, but you tell yourself these things like for me personally, I tell myself failure is not an option, but I turn that around and I allow that to be motivation, but I digress. You were
No,
talking
well, it's a good point. I think fail forward is really the healthiest way because nothing gets done without failure. Like you don't learn how to not do something. Nobody ever does anything perfect. Like that's the first thing all perfectionists need to accept. and I was never a perfectionist, but the
I needed to hear that.
nobody ever does anything perfect. So to expect that is
Yeah.
going to be a super anxious place of living. So since nobody does
Mhm.
anything perfect, you get to get out there and do the best that you can on something, and whatever doesn't work gets to give you information that you get to then take and move forward with. It either shows you
Yep.
how not to do something, like the creator of the light bulb. How many times did
Yeah,
yeah,
1,000, I think
yep.
Edison was. Yeah.
And I've even
Yeah.
heard 50,000. Like I learned 50,000 ways not to do the light bulb. It's just
Yeah.
it's persistence, and I think that
Right.
once you can comprehend that everybody's going to fail, it's the only way you learn anything, right? You fail, you learn what not to do, then you try again with the new information that you have, and it's one step, two steps forward, one step back. Like we're taking these baby steps, and sometimes there's a backward one because you figure out how not to
Mhm.
do it. It's just part of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point because, well, the first is that failure, as you mentioned before, is seen as a negative. It's something, oh, you failed at that. Well, I think we need to start reframing how we even say the word failure. It's like, oh, you failed. Great. What did you learn from it? I mean, that's really should be our perspective. We get so excited when people achieve and they accomplish something and you're like, oh, wow, that's great. I'm glad you did that. You accomplished that. You're great. You're wonderful. I think we need to start a movement out there on failure and go, wow, you failed.
What did you
Congratulations. That's
learn?
awesome. What did you learn? What's next? What can you do differently the next time? Because as you said, that's where the growth happens. That's if when we go back and we look at that failure, then we go like, oh, okay. It does take some work. I mean, even me still personally, I can say to you, yes, let's get excited about failure, but there's still a reframing that even I have to go through because I have experienced through most of my lifetime that failure is not an option. So when I failed, I put it on myself personally. And I think that's the other thing too, that when those of us, especially perfectionists, they take failure extremely personal.
Nobody likes to fail. It
And
feels yucky.
yeah, it does. It does. But if you tell yourself, okay, I failed, now it's get up, move on, learn, go to the next thing. I failed
Or
and,
yeah, right.
you know,
Or
I failed
maybe
and
instead of using
okay.
failed too, you could just say, "This didn't turn out as I had expected. So
Oh,
what's
yeah.
what's the shift here and how I'm gonna move forward?" You know? Is it really a fail if you learn something from it? Is it really a fail
Well,
if
that's true.
you gosh, I'm reading another book right now, and this comes up in lots of discussions because it's such a pertinent thing to being humans. We spend
Hmm.
lots of time staying away from anything that could be construed as failure when it's such an important part of how we learn and grow.
Yeah.
So
That's
yeah,
paralyzing,
we
but
can sit and talk about it like, "Oh, it's so easy. Let's all just do this." But the truth is,
yeah.
I don't wanna fail. You don't wanna fail. Like, it has a yucky feeling to it, but there's that advanced place of comprehending intellectually that, "Okay, this has given me information. It's okay." And then that story you build around failure, right, depends
Hmm.
on how you're gonna internalize it. Is it really something that
Hmm.
kicks your feet out from under you, or is it something you learn from? And we're back to the story again. The
Right,
story
right.
is subjective, and you decide the meaning of that story. So what does failure mean to you?
Yeah,
Or what does that thing
right.
turning out different than you expected mean to you?
I think I read it on your website somewhere. I love the concept of change your story, change your
Mm.
reality. So I would love for you to unpack that because what I find really interesting is when you think about our past, it really can't be changed. But when you say the phrase change your story, change your reality, there's a call to action there to change our story. But the story's already happened. So I'm very curious. Will you unpack that, please? So let's go
I
there.
think if we're talking about past stories, again, it's about what you choose to focus on. And I do think that it's important to acknowledge we're not going to make up a story that didn't happen. We're not going to create a fallacy. We're not writing fiction so that it sounds better than it was. What we're doing is choosing what we focus on. like we said before, if we are creating a story of us, we'll use mine again, of being a victim, of being abused, of being, married and suppressed by men for 20 years, of being used, of, all the things, that's a story, but that's not supportive. That's a focus
Right.
on the broken parts. So change your story is as simple as the focusing on the meaning, focusing on the learning, focusing on what I gained and learned and where that's taken me. And where has that taken me? I am married to a really good man now in a healthy relationship. I've learned lots of things, and there I have
Right.
created the Love Your Story podcast, which has had 8 strong years of sharing and understanding story. I have a master's degree that's around personal narrative because my need to get my own personal story, to understand story, to comprehend the function and the structure of story and personal narrative was so important to me in dealing with my own life, which is often what academic work is about, right? We have some personal stake in it. Like there's lots of great things that have come from my path in life, even though that path was woven with struggle and heartbreak. What do I focus on? That change my story, change my reality. I could be a completely different person. And I know, let's use the example. I knew a woman once who had been sexually abused when she was a teenager. And because of that, sure, her growth was kind of stunted there. So she always acted like a 16-year-old. And gosh, how old was she? She was probably in her late 60s when I knew her, and she would say really inappropriate sexual things in public places, and she would make comments and do things that just were really reflected that she was stuck in that space, that she spent a lot of time, and she took her family with her there because anytime she would do something inappropriate in public, her kids would always say, oh, well, this happened to her when she was young, and she would always use it as an excuse for behaving badly as well. I mean, this is one example that just came on the top of my head, but her story of being abused and broken and not able to function and using it as an excuse, her victimhood as an excuse to
Right.
cause problems. That's not to say people don't have legitimate real problems that they need to work through. I'm not saying that, but there is a difference in stories according to if you do the work to heal a story versus if you don't.
Right. So if you don't do the work, it sounds like that's kind of like the victim mentality
Yeah.
road. That if you're choosing not to really, use your story for good in a way or heal with it or interact with it, it can turn out to be
Are you the hero or are you the victim of your story? Yeah, who wants to stay there? Who wants to stay in the muggy swamp where the dragons are breathing down on you and you're stuck and you can't move and you're hurting all the time? That's not where anybody wants to stay.
right, right. What's one thing that you thought it'd be hard about your story, but it turns out that it wasn't? I know it's a broad question, but
Nothing. I say that because I think that I don't think you go into your stories as one of the questions that I asked when I was first doing my research. I was trying to decide what I wanted to when I did my doctorate degree, what question I wanted to ask, and this was way back right after I got my master's, and it was, did your life turn out as expected? So I did a whole
mm,
pre-dissertation research thing and got a diverse group of women from all over the country, different ages, different religions, all the different things. It was a really good sampling. And 19 out of 20 women's lives did not turn out as they expected. And as I kind of dissected that, I got to this space where, of course, our lives don't turn out as expected because when we're young, we're not thinking about the divorce and the eating disorder and the friend who kills themselves and the job loss and the the being molested at work or whatever. We're not thinking about those things. We don't know about those things. We're thinking about
yeah,
what kind of relationships we want. We're happily ever after. And we're thinking about, well, I want to be a doctor. And, we're thinking about all the good things. And so we don't imagine what those bad things are. So nobody's lives turn out that way because we don't foresee all the twists and turns that take us on our learning journey. And so I don't know that I ever pictured, oh, this is going to be really hard. And then it wasn't. because I don't think we picture that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. I've asked that question a number of times. You're actually the first person that answered there was nothing. It was all hard. And no, I appreciate it. I actually really appreciate it because it allows us to remember that one, we're all human, and two, we all of us go through trials and tribulations, and nobody gets out of life without at least walking through one difficult season
Mm,
or one difficult circumstance. We all have it. Nobody
that's very
escapes.
true.
So I appreciate the comment because it really does make us think, yeah, you know what? Sometimes all life is hard. We have pockets of interesting things or
Yeah,
good things that
absolutely.
happen. You go on vacation, birth of a child,
Oh, lots of great
child
things.
getting married,
Oh,
things
yeah.
like that. Lots of
Magic every day.
awesome, wonderful things. Yeah. Oh,
Mhm.
absolutely. And I think you also brought up before too, what we focus on
Mhm.
expands. So if we're going to focus on things, let's pick the positive things to focus
Love
on.
it.
And a small step for today is just pick one positive thing that happened in your day. Search each day out for one awesome thing that happened that
Sue, that's
day.
beautiful advice.
Just
I
go
totally
find it.
agree. Yeah. Well, and I think that that
Yeah.
mindset of abundance starts with we will find proof for what we are looking for. That's how the mind is.
Hmm.
And so when we
Love
are
it.
focused on gratitude, then we are going to find proof of things that are abundant and good and happy for us. And so
Hmm.
that gratitude really more than just the great chemical rush of feeling supported and feeling happy and grateful, there's the training of the brain to look for proof of abundance and goodness around us, and those
Hmm.
ideas become super important. Like you say, what you focus on expands, so choose habitually to focus on the things that you're grateful for, and you're automatically going to transition into places of abundance and joy.
Yeah. I love that choice. I think we forget we all have choices. We can choose. We choose. It's funny. We can choose our reality, choose
Yes.
how we look at things, because I've heard it said once, and I'm not sure if you came across this in your research, that, our brain doesn't know the difference between fact or
Mhm.
fiction.
I've heard that said.
I've heard it, but what you tell yourself, we can tell ourselves these stories. And it's our reality. It's what we see going on in front of us. So, yeah, and it's a choice.
Well, like you said, you shift your what you focus on expands, and you brought this up earlier. I don't know if you can read this, but change your thoughts
Yeah.
and you change your world, right? I think you said it,
Yes,
change your
absolutely.
story and you change your reality. Same thing, right?
Hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
what it boils down to. And those small steps of you can change a thought. That really is a small step. But when you
It is.
change a thought and it changes your reality, reality is a big thing. So, one small thought change
Yeah.
at a time, you create the reality and the story that you want. That's legit.
Yeah, that's right. I love it. Yeah, I love it. Lori, we could talk for probably another hour, but I want to wrap up our time together with the core three that I always ask my guests. So the first is, could you share a book that's had a significant impact on
Oh,
you?
there are so many. But the one I'm reading right now is a gal that I interviewed on my podcast that's coming out in December. Give Yourself Permission by Courtney McDermott.
Mm,
And this one is, yeah, she's talking about all these things. We're talking about energy and fun and manifesting and quantum physics and all the parts and pieces of using our mind for creating these spaces that we're talking about, right? Like creating possibility
yeah.
and relaxing into the lives we want to live.
Mm. Have you ever heard of The Untethered Soul or The Surrender
Yes.
Experiment? Two
Yes,
books.
yes.
Yeah, by Michael Singer. He talks a lot about relaxing and
See, which
releasing and
when I
allowing.
read that book, The Surrender Experiment, I don't get it, right? Like I keep reading these books and trying to comprehend it because relaxing is into accomplishment doesn't make any sense to me. So I'm still struggling with it, but that's why I'm
Okay.
studying it.
Really? You know what? I have to say, I mean, this is your podcast, but the surrender experiment changed my life. I
It's a
read
good
it
one.
about 4 months ago. And then I read The Untethered Soul, which I would recommend reading Surrender Experiment first and then The Untethered Soul. And for me, it was just relaxing and releasing into circumstances. It's like you accept it, you allow it to pass through. I'm a very visual
Mhm.
learner. So it kind of visually, like I could visually see that thing going through me. And he said, you sit yourself in it, but you don't, you grieve, you do whatever it is that you have to do with it, but then you let it go. And he said, once you let it go, then that inner peace comes back and it brings you back to that place of kind of acceptance, but also centering.
That's probably very similar to what we're talking about with reframing the story, right?
Yeah, with reframing. Yeah, same thing. Same thing. I mean, I think there's now a lot more information out there and it comes in different packages. And the beauty of that is that we're all different and we all learn differently. So what could be reframing for you is relaxing,
Mhm.
releasing for somebody else, and it'll work for who you're talking to, and resonate
So true.
with them, where somebody else might not get it, but yet somebody might actually identify with relax and release, but not reframing. So I think in that there is no one size fits all.
Mm,
I think you
true.
mentioned that earlier in the podcast too. There is no one size fits all for everybody. So there's something out there for everybody, and the way it's explained will resonate how it's going to resonate. What's one topic or question you wish I would have asked about, and how would you have answered the question or expanded on the
Man, you
topic?
got hard questions.
I've I've heard that before.
I think we did a pretty darn good job of exploring the subjectivity of story. I think the crucial thing for people to understand, and that I always hope makes sense, is how much personal control we have over our own lives, over our reality. Like, we are beings who get to choose what we think about. We are beings who get to choose where we spend our time and what we focus on, which habits we create. And absolutely, those things take work. It takes work to monitor your thoughts, to be self aware, and it takes work to release thoughts that you don't want to harbor. We are not all of the things that we think. We get thousands, tens of thousands of thoughts a day, and we are not all of those things. So as we sift through them, we get to keep the ones that we want, that we feel are supportive and good for us, and we build our habits around those things. And so while I feel like we've really discussed this thoroughly, in answer to your question, one more thing to add to it all, I think, is just how powerful we are as people to control the narrative of our story, that there's not ever an excuse. If you're unhappy, look at the narrative you're creating and figure out how you can write yourself out of it. Write bigger and better things for yourself
I love
through
that.
one mind shift after another. You can do it. We can do it.
I
We're
love that.
powerful.
I love it. I love it. We have more control over our lives than we
Hmm.
think. As we close, what's one small step that someone can do today that's going to help them change their tomorrow?
Let's go with awareness. Start being aware of the thoughts that are crossing your mind, and then as you're being aware of them, which ones don't you like? Which ones feel yucky to you? Which ones are like, ooh. The other day, I'll share a personal experience, but the other day, like, there's this little mean side inside of me that I'm like, oh, am I a mean person? Am I a mean person because I thought this mean thought? And I realized I am not. All these thoughts that go through my mind. Like, I know I'm not a mean person. I think of all of the people that I help, and all of the kind things that I do for my neighbors, and all the service that I give to my kids, and all the things, right? And I do those because I naturally want to do those and create good. So I know I'm not a mean person. So then when I have that mean thought, instead of saying, oh, because I sat there with it for a while going, oh, am I a mean person? Like, how can I be a mean person? It was actually
Yeah.
for a couple of weeks because I kept thinking, that doesn't jive. But as I decided to dismiss those thoughts and realize there's proof to the contrary, I am not a mean person. I'm just going to dismiss those thoughts. And I feel like we can do that. So the one thing, I'll bring it around. The one thing is, be aware of the thoughts that you're thinking, the ones that feel good to you, that feel happy, nurture those, give place for them. And the ones that don't, just dismiss them. Say, I don't have a place for that. you can leave and don't think about it again, you know? And if it keeps popping up, keep dismissing it. Like, that's a simple, yes, it takes time, and yes, it takes self-awareness, but that's the one thing. Be aware. Start to monitor.
Oh, Lori, thank you for the gift of your time. How can people reach out to you and find you?
Well, the podcast you can listen to on any podcast app. You can also find it at loveyourstorypodcast.com. So that's easy. All the episodes there. And also, if any of you are looking to have a podcast made, I would love to support you with my company, Pod Productions. Just reach out to me at Lori, LORIJ, LEE at msn.com, or you can go to loveyourstorypodcast.com, and there's a place to leave me a note, or there's a voicemail, a little recorder in the bottom that you can push and leave me a voicemail. So either of those ways, you are welcome to get a hold of me, but I would love to help you with any podcasting production that you need help with. We can talk about it and see if it's a good fit and see what you have in mind and what you need, and just talk about that for
Perfect.
a bit.
All right, great. Well, Lori, thank you again for the gift of your time. This has been wonderful.
Sue, thanks for letting me be on the show. Great show. I love the concept of
Sure.
small steps and big wins, because that's just another universal truth.
And I love your story because we all have stories to tell. So, all right. Well, thanks again, Lori.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Small Steps, Big Wins podcast. I value your time with me, and I seek to make every moment count. In order to make lasting change in your life, listening is usually not enough. So I want to ask you, what practical steps are you going to put into action today as a result of listening to this podcast? Remember, any step, any action, no matter how small, starts your journey to a big win. And if you're not sure where to get started, check out my website, personalcoachfinder.com, and find someone who can help. Remember, life doesn't get better by chance, it gets better by choice. Take small steps today and make your life awesome, friends.